All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Hello, Salesforce partners, allies, and community activists. In true Salesforce fashion, we want to start by first thanking you for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us as we take a walk through history. We're Boldforce and Vetforce, and we're doing this jointly. And literally, your mere presence today adds gravity to the ongoing efforts to exonerate the Port Chicago 50. My name is Tom House. My pronouns are he, him, and his, and I am the new San Francisco Vetforce Hub president. Today, I have the distinct pleasure of introducing you to a little known yet significant event in our nation's history. The event took place on July 17, 1944 in San Francisco's backyard on the other side of the bay in Concord, California, where an explosion claimed the lives of 320 sailors. 2/3 of those were Black African-American sailors. That same explosion was also the largest explosion and largest loss of life on the home front during World War II. It's a story of the actions of 50 Black African-American sailors, now known as the Port Chicago 50, who stood up for their rights in the face of racism in the aftermath of the explosion that ultimately forced desegregation of the military, ignited the civil rights movement, and confronted the might of the military court system that wrongfully charged and convicted these sailors of mutiny. We have a super incredible and special program for you today that starts with a 9-minute video to help set the stage. And then we'll spend time with Keith White, our SVP of Chief Global Safety and Security Officer, as he interviews 4 Port Chicago 50 trailblazers who will give you a personal perspective and insight into the movement to exonerate the Port Chicago 50 today. And then we'll close with some calls to action on how we can accelerate the efforts to exonerate the Port Chicago 50. And with that, I'll turn it over to my co-host, who is also the Boldforce co-president, Jean Williams, for a brief opening.
Thank you, Tom, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for taking time out of your schedules to join us for today's programming. It is so important for us to continue to understand the ramifications of past actions. While this is something that might feel like it's far in the past, its impact is still felt today, and it is so crucial for us to keep that in mind. More importantly, the reason this is a joint effort with Boldforce and Vetforce is because while this is a military event, these actions really are heavily influenced by the race of those soldiers. So let's be really intentional with our observations as we learn about what happened at the Port Chicago 50.
And if you would, please, your microphones are already muted. Take your conversation to the Vetforce San Francisco Hub Slack channel. It's right there on the slide. So EQ Vetforce San Francisco would be ideal, and we will get started. We'll start with this Into Forgetfulness video.
In our lives, there are moments, events, usually lasting a very short time, that result in irreversible change. As a people, we have a need to memorialize these events so that future generations will know and remember. July 17th, 1944, at 10:17 p.m., a peaceful, quiet California summer night, thousands of miles from the fighting of World War II, an event took place. In one explosive moment, 320 men vanished, and in the rubble, the way the military and America treated its citizens began to change.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately
Most of the black sailors stationed at Port Chicago had enlisted hoping to fight the enemy. Unable to serve on the front lines, they found themselves doing dangerous, manual labor. Munitions manufactured around the country would arrive at Port Chicago daily by train. As a transit site, not a storage site, the cargo had to be unloaded as rapidly as possible. It was the job of the black enlisted sailors to manually transfer the munitions from the rail cars to large cargo ships. With war raging in the Pacific, victory depended on rapid delivery of munitions, and the sailors of Port Chicago were proud of their crucial link in the delivery process. Ignoring standard safety practices, 2 ships were loaded at one pier. The work proceeded 24 hours a day. All the sailors handling cargo were black. All the officers in charge were white. Competition was encouraged by the officers. Loading rates for each division were posted, and incentives were awarded. Slower divisions were shamed and threatened. Officers and sailors cut corners to save time. Many people warned the fast pace of the work, the huge volume of munitions being moved, loading 2 ships on one pier, and the lack of proper training, proper safety procedures would lead to disaster. 2 explosions, 6 seconds apart, ignited the night sky with a column of fire and steel rising 2 miles. The first blast was fairly small. The second incinerated 2 ships, the pier, 16 rail cars, 320 men. The survivors were in shock. Friends had disappeared without a trace. Next time, it would be them. On August 9th, 300 black sailors were ordered back to work, loading munitions. Continued lack of training, unsafe working conditions, lack of any official explanation. Everyone believed another explosion would happen. The benefits of Navy life no longer outweighed the extreme danger of the work. Any order but that. Any order but that. After a peaceful confrontation, over 250 black sailors were arrested. The sailors were given the opportunity to put the so-called uprising behind them and return to work. About 200 reluctantly agreed, but were instead thrown in the brig. The 50 remaining black enlisted sailors who refused to load munitions were charged with mutiny. in time of war, punishable by death. On October 24, 1944, the specially convened military court found all 50 men guilty of mutiny as charged. All were sentenced 8 to 15 years in prison and dishonorable discharge from the Navy. Port Chicago Naval Magazine National Memorial was established to honor the courage and commitment of the sailors, Marines, National Guardsmen, Merchant Marines, and civilians killed and injured in the largest homeland disaster during World War II. The memorial recognizes the critical role they and the survivors of the explosion played in the winning of the war in the Pacific. The explosion and its aftermath was a major catalyst that helped persuade the U.S. military to begin the long journey to racial justice and equality. Port Chicago Naval Magazine National Memorial will ensure the story of these brave men is not lost into forgetfulness.
Pretty incredible story, if you ask me. And with that, I will turn it over to our four trailblazers and our own Keith White. Keith, over to you, sir.
First of all, a heartfelt thanks to Tom for his leadership and steadfastness in terms of bringing this story to light, creating this forum. We couldn't be more grateful. So thank you, Tom. I really appreciate your leadership. I also want to recognize our panelists, and I think it's probably best for me to ask for each of them to give a brief introduction of themselves. That probably do it justice, and then we'll get into some really good dialogue, I hope. All right, why don't we start with Reverend Diana, if you'd be so kind.
Well, I'm Diana McDaniel. I am the president of the Friends of Port Chicago National Memorial, a Friends group. I serve, my regular job is as minister of Unity Church of San Leandro. And my volunteer work, at least this part of it, is with the Friends of Port Chicago National Memorial. I have a passion for it, and I have been involved in it, I think, over 20 years. You know, I sort of lost count. So that's me.
Okay, welcome and thank you so much for joining us. How about you, Kelly? Could you introduce yourself?
Absolutely. And thank you for having us here today. My name is Kelly English, and I am the Division Manager or Chief of Interpretation, Education, and Outreach here at Port Chicago Naval Magazine National Memorial, a unit of the National Park Service.
Okay, great. Really good to have you. Yuli, would you be kind enough to introduce yourself?
Yes, I second Kelly's sentiments. Very grateful to be here today. I'm Yuli Padmore, co-founder of the Black Employee Collective, East Bay Regional, very proud East Bay Regional Park District employee, and huge supporter of this work. And I could not do this without my co-founders who are, I believe they're here today. They're just not on camera. But Yolanda Burial Knight and Sabrina Pinnell, without them, the Black Employee Collective wouldn't have happened. So, but that's who I am. Thank you so much for having me, Keith.
All right, fantastic. Appreciate that. Jason, could you introduce yourself?
Absolutely. And I'd like to say thank you also for inviting me to this event. It's really important, and I'm glad to be a part of it. I am a 30-year vet from the Air Force Reserve, and the Air National Guard, served in all three branches, recently retired in 2015. I'm also a narrator, voiceover artist, and a board member of the Friends of Port Chicago National Memorial. I recently became a board member this year. So I'm happy to be a part of that and happy to be a part of this event.
Okay, fantastic. What a distinguished panel. Really looking forward to hearing your thoughts. And as Tom said, I'm Keith White. I head up global safety and security for Salesforce, and it is an absolute honor to be able to enlighten everyone on the Port Chicago 50. What a mark in American history, not just African American history. So with that in mind, Reverend Diana and Jason, let's just start off with a question that asks both of you to kind of frame the place in history that you think this event has. A lot of folks are finding out about this, including myself, in recent years, and we're just amazed. I live in the Bay Area, so for me, it was a rude awakening that something this momentous could happen, and for me not to know about it. And I pride myself on really knowing my history and African American history in particular around civil rights, but I had no idea. So, what place in history does this serve as you guys think about that?
You know, my personal opinion about the importance of this event and its role in history has to do, you know, with the facts of the matter. Specifically, this event involved the military, it involved racism, it involved how African Americans were treated, even though we decided that we wanted to serve as all others had served during the war. You know, that sentiment of service, that idea that we want to be part of something that is greater than ourselves has been with us, you know, since we've landed here, even though our arrival was forced. I think it's important that we share this story with as many folks as possible so that they can understand this history and so that we can avoid repeating aspects of this history, which we know to this day still continue. So the fact that this story is not shared widely and is not known well is really appalling. I myself, having been part of the military for 30 years, served in an organization that had every branch of service, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines. We even had one Coast Guard individual. And when I brought this story up amongst my colleagues in arms at the time, this was at the Pentagon, not one of them had ever heard of this story, including some African American sailors. So, I think the opportunity exists for us to share this story, not only within the civilian community, but in the military community as well, so that, we don't run afoul of the things that took place here in the future.
Okay, thank you. Reverend Diana?
Thank you, Jason. I was thinking that without this explosion, without the blatant racism, our military wouldn't be desegregated at this point. At least that's our belief. When the explosion occurred and when the sailors refused to go back to work, they refused to go back to work, and we call it a work stoppage, not a mutiny that they were tried for, that they wanted to be trained, they wanted to be given equipment, proper equipment, in order to do the work of loading the munitions safely. But it didn't happen. They were just told to go back to work. So to me, it was without the proper training, without the proper equipment, they were treating them like they were mules, not doing the work that like they were human beings. So, but for me, it was a seminal point of things changing. This happened prior to Rosa Parks, prior to things that were happening on the East Coast. This happened in 1944, and it was a very important movement. One of the things that I thought you might find interesting is that at the time, apparently, there had been some discussion about desegregating the military with people like Eleanor Roosevelt and some notables. And they were interested in having desegregated troops. However, they didn't quite know how to do it. But once this explosion happened and they accused our sailors of mutiny, there was this movement. It actually supported this desegregation because they were afraid that Black sailors on other bases would come together and stick together and really have a mutiny. So there was a positive outcome from something so negative.
Wow, that's amazing and extremely insightful. But that's part of our history. Thank you, Yuli, Kelly. I have to ask, why was this story lost? Where did it lose its footing? You're talking over 200 and some odd African American sailors or armed services, I should say, members killed in an explosion that rated as high as I think 4.3 on the Richter scale. I'm told this was big news, and it also had an audience of the Supreme Court. So how does this not make the history books? So what would you say to that?
I think personally, I think much of the attention directed towards the disaster in the Port Chicago 50 focuses on the mutiny trial, and a trial that should have never taken place at all. So unfortunately, the mutiny angle reinforced the notion that these sailors were guilty, and combined with the disaster, which made the public perceive this history to be a very depressing stain. This is, of course, on our American history. And rather than what it truly is, which is beauty, right? Beauty out of tragedy. From this tragedy came courage. From this tragedy of this explosion came bravery. I look at these men as my heroes, and I say that with pride, very much so. And as Reverend Diana said, it's a significant seminal moment in our nation's civil rights history. And so how did it get lost? You know, I think that's a question that we're all asking, but I always love to hear what Kelly has to say. So she is the interpreter and has the history here. So Kelly, what do you think?
Sure. Well, first off, I think it cannot be understated that the entire episode at Port Chicago, from the disaster to the mutiny trial, was an embarrassment for the Navy in a very big way and at a critical time in the war. The fact that one of their own bases had blown up was an incredibly costly disaster, both in terms of lives and in terms of financial and military resources. It was an embarrassment that this had happened. And then to have all of these sailors who then were refusing to return to the work of loading munitions. I actually was just in the rereading some of the oral histories from some of the Port Chicago 50 recently, and it struck me that they very much believed that the Navy convicted them. There was a foregone conclusion that they were going to be convicted, and part of it was that the Navy had to save face, and that was deemed critical at the time. So I don't want to underscore the fact that the Navy always wanted this to kind of go away once they had conducted this trial and convicted the sailors. And in subsequent years, they were not really very interested in having the story become public. The other part of this too, specifically with the Port Chicago 50, I mean, they were, as you saw from the film, they were given lengthy prison sentences. They didn't end up serving that length of time. As the war came to an end, the Navy realized that it was really overkill to try to impose those sentences. So most of the men's sentences were ultimately not necessarily reduced, but they only served between about 1 to 3 years for the most of them. However, the men still had dishonorable discharges on their records, and that followed them for the rest of their lives. And when Dr. Robert Allen at UC Berkeley began doing oral histories with them in the 70s and 80s, many of the men were really reluctant to talk about this story, to talk about the fact that they had been tried and convicted of mutiny. It was definitely, it had been a source of shame for them through most of their lives. In many cases, they hadn't even told their families about what they had experienced as young men with this. So I think that is part of the reason why this story, those factors, and there's plenty of others, but I think those factors are definitely huge in terms of contributing to the fact that this story was hushed up for a long, long time. And it really wasn't until Dr. Allen's seminal work, The Port Chicago Mutiny, really coming out with a lot of information from these oral histories from these sailors was published. And then around all the energy that happened in the 90s around the 50th anniversary of the explosion, which ultimately resulted in both the memorial being created as well as Freddie Meeks, one of the 50, receiving a pardon from President Clinton and bringing further public awareness of the story. That was really, it wasn't really until the last 30 years that this story really started to be more known and acknowledged more openly. And the Navy is still pretty reluctant to own this story. I think that's something that we can work towards in the future, for them to finally admit what happened and take responsibility for how this story unfolded.
Okay, thanks. That really helps. The fact that it was a source of embarrassment really says a lot about why it wasn't captured in history the way it should have been. You know, when we think about their own personal embarrassment and experiences, we're really fortunate to have Jason as a panelist because he's a descendant of one of the Port Chicago 50 in Jason and even Reverend Diana, if there are personal stories that you can share that would help us understand the plight of these men, that would be really appreciated.
Absolutely. I'll share first, Reverend Diana, if that's okay. So I am actually a descendant, a nephew of one of the sailors who was actually killed in the Port Chicago disaster, Seaman Second Class John B. Fellisbrett. He was 17 at the time of the explosion, and he wasn't supposed to be on the pier. He actually had leave, but swapped it, or furlough, to go in town. He swapped that with a shipmate so that he could allow him to go ashore, to go into town and enjoy some time off while he took his place on the pier. Um, and that was his final act of kindness. My uncle is survived by his only sibling. He was one of 13. The only sibling that is currently surviving is my mother. She is currently 85 years old. And she made me aware of this story. And it's really odd how that came about. I had served in the military at the time I found out about this story for 20 years. I had been in the Air Force Reserve for 20 years and did not know this story. In the military, we often have training that tells us about the history of the military, the history of individuals in the military, specifically in our branches, but collectively across all branches. But this story was never told. So my mother had given us a copy of Dr. Allen's book, The Port Chicago Mutiny, the story of the largest mass mutiny trial in US naval history. And when I say us, I mean, my mom bought probably about 20 copies and gave it to every family member, every descendant of John Fellisbrett that she could think of. Upon giving me that book and reading the story, I was overwhelmed. One, because I did not know the history, and two, because the history directly impacted me. There are a number of members of my family who have served in the military. I have several folks that have retired, several folks who have served and gotten out. My sister, Allison, served in the Army Guard, and she retired from there as well. She didn't know about the story until the book was shared with us. So once my mother shared the story with us, shared the book with us, I immediately became, hyper focused on the story and wanted to know more about it. Fortunately, I was able to fly my mother to the Port Chicago National Memorial for its dedication back in 2010. And that was shortly after she told me about the story. So I thought it only fitting that, as a direct next of kin, her older brother, that we should be there for that dedication. And I'm really glad that I was able to take her. That is part of the reason I'm not able to be there this weekend, because I actually care for my mother now. But knowing the story, understanding the history, feeling the personal impact in my family made me absolutely want to be a part of the story. And that led to my actually narrating Dr. Allen's book. So I had received a email from the VA as a military retiree indicating that I could look for the burial ground of any ancestors who had died serving in any capacity during any war. So I thought, that's great. I'll look up my Uncle Junie, as we call them, and see where he's interred. I searched their database and his name is not found at all. So that prompted me to reach out to Reverend Diana and reach out to Dr. Allen and asked them if I could be a part of this story and narrate the audiobook for them because I am a voiceover artist. That is a way that I felt I could contribute to the story, make sure that more people hear the story in a different format. Um, you know, plenty of folks like to read books, but some people in their hustle and bustle prefer to listen to audiobooks. So knowing that was an opportunity, I decided to jump in. So I'm glad to be a part of this story. I think it's understandable that it's important just based on the little we've shared thus far. But for a full accounting of the story, I would direct everyone to Dr. Allen's book. If you prefer to get the paperback, it's available on Amazon. If you would like to hear the oral story, that is available on Audible.
Okay, thank you for that. Reverend Diana?
Yeah, and thank you, Jason, for doing that. His voice is wonderful. He's done a fabulous job on that.
Thank you.
Voiceover, thank you. For personal, I have an uncle who served there when the explosion happened. He was in his barracks. He said he was sitting, preparing to go to bed. He was reading, and he was using his bed like a desk. And he said he was sitting in a chair, using the bed like a desk, and then suddenly there was an explosion, and he was thrown and cast through the wall of windows. And he said the first thing they did was just check people to find out how things were going, who was hurt or whatever. He said, and then he ran off and got a truck from the rec center. It was apparently a recreation center. He said where he worked, he didn't load munitions. He had gotten his degree in physical education, and they were utilizing him in the rec center. Well, they had a basketball team and they had various things going on. And he said they had a truck. So he ran over there and got the truck, brought it back to take people, to use it like an ambulance, to take people to, I think they said it was Camp Shoemaker. Kelly, you might know that. But they took him over to a medical center. He said that happened, they worked around the clock. He said it wasn't like they had any supervisors telling them what to do. They just knew to go into action to help everybody. And he said that when he actually stopped working about 3 days later, they said they worked around the clock. He said that he discovered that he had glass in his back. He didn't know it because he hadn't laid down or hadn't really stopped. He said, but when he did lay down, he discovered he had some minor injuries, but nothing major. When we would have family gatherings, he lived in Ohio, he and my aunt, Carol, and they would come to where I lived in Florida periodically, like for holidays, Thanksgiving, Christmas, that sort of thing. And we'd have dinners together. And I can remember he and my father, my brother, and the men who were in the family would sort of go to the living room or someplace and they're talking about things and they would get angry. It was about World War II, some explosion that had happened. And I actually didn't stay in the room because I didn't want to hear it. I was a kid, growing up. I didn't want to hear any big people arguing about what happened during the war. Anyway, I found out later, after having visited Port Chicago Naval Magazine, National Memorial, I thought I'd call my father. Maybe 3 weeks later, I called him and I said, is this the place that Uncle Irvin was talking about, the explosion? And it turned out that it was. So he served there during that time. I discovered it. I didn't know the story, even though everybody else in the family apparently knew the story but me, because I didn't stay in the room, to hear it. but somehow I have found myself working with it, and it is, I think it's a very important story that we have to keep alive.
No doubt. I know from having family members who served in the armed services, uh, they are typically reluctant to even talk about that experience. So for both of you to have some insight into what they experienced and to be able to share is a real blessing.
Keith, let me tell you that he not only talked about it, he argued about it.
Oh,
he was totally, he was very biased. He was totally against the Japanese. He was totally against the war. He wouldn't even buy a Japanese model car, in recent years. He was but he would talk. I mean, it's just that I wasn't around. I just didn't listen. Very vocal.
So that leads us to Thurgood Marshall's role in this whole thing. And Yuli and Kelly, a lot of people don't realize that Thurgood Marshall, before he sat on the Supreme Court, he was actually an awesome civil rights attorney who defended or presented cases before the Supreme Court. And many would argue he was a better lawyer than he was a jurist on the Supreme Court because of all the cases he won. And I'm just wondering if you guys could shed some light on, because the park is named after him. So what was Thurgood Marshall's role in this series of events?
Okay, well, Keith, if you're wondering why I keep going in front of Kelly, is because I know she'll clean it up after. She's so good at her job. But for Thurgood Marshall, hero of mine, and oftentimes, and the name of the park is Thurgood Marshall, which, you would ask yourself, why are we not recognizing the fact that he was a Supreme Court justice? Well, this was during his prime years, that he's here in the Bay Area advocating for these men. He's a young counselor. How inspiring is that, right? As a young person who is advocating. And I personally look to Thurgood Marshall, and we often talk about his work in the hallway work that he did, right? And a lot of people may not know. I mean, he had to, come and support the men in the court of public opinion because he wasn't allowed to defend them in the naval courts, right? So he came to the community. He talked to the press. He said, these men, it's not these men who should be on trial, but the Navy who should be on trial for their vicious practices. And this, of course, I'm paraphrasing here, but paraphrasing encourages research. And so I really encourage everybody to look this up. But Thurgood Marshall and his role, meeting individually with each of those men and hearing their stories, such a major role that he played, going to the White House, his advocacy in the White House, and passing out pamphlets, which eventually made it in the hands of Eleanor Roosevelt, right? And how you really don't know that someone is doing all this work all the time. Sometimes there's front-facing, there is certain groups that get attention, but Thurgood Marshall is his role known as much work as he did. I honestly, I have to give a shout out to our East Bay Regional Park District, Brian Holt, who is the chief of planning trails and design, he's the one who first told me about this story. And I didn't know, just like you. I think there's so many of us who are out here who didn't know this story. And I just learned about it in 2019. And when you go through the history and look all this stuff up, it further fascinated me. And knowing that Thurgood Marshall was actually here in the Bay Area and the significant role that he played, and the how important he was to these men, right? How important he was to these men, because having a person in that time specifically, when segregation and all of that racism is so prevalent, to have someone who is traveling the nation come and support you and fight on your behalf. So that is my feeling about Thurgood Marshall. I think he's very powerful. I'm sure I will hand it over to Kelly, who can give you the stats. And I must say, another shout out. We do have incredible interpretive staff at the East Bay Regional Park District who provide this history as well. Kevin Damstra and Ashley Adams at the park through a public access tour. And they're also very, very positive and great history tellers. So shout out to them, and let me know if you ever want to meet them. I'd be happy to make that introduction, but I'll pass it on to Kelly.
Thanks, Yuli. I don't know that I have a lot of stats to play cleanup with exactly, but because I don't really need to play cleanup. I think you did a fabulous job really articulating Marshall's role. And the only thing that I think I have to add is pulling together what you were saying and then what Tom put in the chat, which is that Thurgood Marshall was, and he knew it, he was up against this enormous military complex that was determined to get this outcome of guilty in this trial. And despite the fact that he knew he was likely waging a losing battle, it was, what was happening was so outrageous that he and the NAACP felt that they had no choice but to try to get involved as much as they were able to do. And Marshall's role was really not allowing the Navy to bury this story, both in terms of the media. He held press conferences outside the trial to let everyone know what was happening. This was covered extensively by the Black newspapers at the time, and also by mainstream, but the San Francisco Chronicle in this area was covering this trial since it was happening right on Treasure Island. And even when the convictions came down, he was not able to participate in helping to defend the men during the trial, but he was able to mount an appeal on their behalf. And so his appeal and all the letter writing that Tom mentioned that he did with the Secretary of the Navy, the pamphlet that he created as part of the appeal process, ultimately the appeal was unsuccessful in terms of affecting a different outcome, but it made it into the White House. The pamphlet caught the attention of, it made it into the hands of then President Harry Truman. And that is part of the reason why this mutiny conviction and the appeal that Marshall mounted on behalf of the men was the catalyst that essentially resulted in the 1948 executive order desegregating the US military. The Navy was not able to hide the fact that they had been committing all of these discriminatory practices, and that was becoming a big problem for them. And they couldn't ignore Marshall's logic, especially because he was talking to the newspapers about it. And so the Navy, one of the things that people sometimes don't realize about this whole event is that at the same time that the Navy was engaging in all these discriminatory practices at Port Chicago Naval Magazine, the Army, on the other hand, who had a very long history of African Americans in service, even at that point, was busy training Black pilots down in Tuskegee Airfield, who became the famous Tuskegee Airmen. So the Navy went from being the branch of the military that was the most segregated and the most behind, so to speak, in terms of utilizing African-American sailors, to then, thanks to this pressure campaign mounted by Marshall, having to kind of lead the way all of a sudden in actively desegregating their practices. I mean, we have incredible letters from 1940 from members of Congress to the Secretary of the Navy talking about how it was impossible to have Black men doing anything but being messmen in the Navy. And they go from that to then completely turning that around within 8 years. As a result of this event and the pressure that they felt both from within and from outside to make huge changes. So again, I think, again, the convictions were pretty much foregone. I think the stats are that the only stats I have on this is that it took them 80 minutes to convict 50 men of mutiny during that trial. And ultimately, the men's convictions stood, and in fact, they still stand today, which most of us find really hard to believe, but is true. Those convictions still stand. However, even though that aspect was not successful, I am not sure that the desegregation of the military would have happened as quickly without this event. It's one of those sort of weird ironies, I guess, of history, that on the one hand, something is an injustice and is unsuccessful. On the other hand, other things happened as a result of it that might have taken a lot longer otherwise. So that's one of some of the really difficult and challenging topics that we can talk about in terms of how small acts, or seemingly small acts like standing up for what's right, and then events that large institutions try to bury, still result in history being changed in ways that one might not have predicted. So
let's stay right here where we're at, because the corollary to that question is, we talked about why is the park named after Thurgood Marshall, but the follow-up to that would be, what's the vision for the park? What can we anticipate as an experience? How will we, honor the legacy of these great men and their sacrifice for our country, et cetera. And my wife and I and other family members have had a chance to visit the park right as it stands right now, and it is hallowed ground. I mean, you feel a certain way when you're there, and it's also a beautiful space at the same time. There's a little irony there, and it feels like it could have some incredible potential to be a destination and an inflection point for people to kind of think about civil rights and its journey on the West Coast, where we typically like to think that we're above all of that, and that we don't have any issues. So Kelly, and really anyone from the panel who wants to comment on this, but Kelly, why don't you kick us off?
Absolutely. And I want to also, because I think there can sometimes be a little bit of confusion about, what's the Park Service role? What's the East Bay Regional Park District role? The Park Service is very excited about the new Thurgood Marshall Regional Park, home of the Port Chicago 50. And just a quick bit of context, the memorial itself was dedicated and established by the Navy, actually, I believe, back in 1994, right around the 50th anniversary of the explosion. And it was still, that at that time, the entire area that's now Military Ocean Terminal Concord was still part of the Concord Naval Weapons Station. As the Concord Naval Weapons Station was wound down and was decommissioned, the area where the explosion occurred is now under the control of the U.S. Army in the 834th Transportation Battalion. So that's Military Ocean Terminal Concord, now controlled by the Army. The site of the memorial was an affiliate site of the National Park Service for a long time, but it was not its own standalone National Park Service site until 2009. It was actually the first piece of legislation signing in a new national park into law that President Obama signed. And the dedication that Jason mentioned earlier was when that site was dedicated shortly thereafter in 2010, when it was its own standalone National Park Service site. But we're located on a military base, which means that there are a lot of operations that are constantly happening. And as much as we would love to take visitors out to the memorial and tell the story all the time, we have frequent closures. Last weekend, we just started doing tours of the memorial for the first time since February because there was an extended spring closure. And so because we know that the Army will continue to use that same deep water port as a resource indefinitely, in that 2009 legislation designating the national park site, it was also legislated that we were able to partner with East Bay Regional Park District on the inland portion of the former Concord Naval Weapons Station to essentially have a joint presence in telling this story. And so that new future Joint Visitor Center in Thurgood Marshall Regional Park, home of the Chicago 50, will be a place where, regardless of whether the memorial is accessible or not, we will be able to talk about the story and interpret it for folks. And it really will be a home for the story, which the memorial has not really been able to be because of its location and the situation. I should say too that Military Ocean Terminal Concord has been a wonderful partner. They have tried to give us as much access as they possibly can, but there's factors outside of their control that dictate whether they can allow visitors onto that site or not. So, so for us, we are thrilled to dive into the partnership and to really explore all the different ways to tell this story and to honor all of the people involved with this history. And I'll pass it over to somebody else now.
Yeah, I'd like to say that the Friends of Port Chicago National Memorial is a 501c3. We are an official friends group, a legal partner with the National Park Service. We work collaboratively with the East Bay Regional Park District, and we were part of the public voice, or we are part of the public voice that advocated for it to become a national park and to be part of the national park system. I'm looking at slides there. Oh, you're going to our website. Fantastic. We are also, our main job had been as advocates to keep the story alive, to honor the people who died, who served, and who protested there. We are also working for exoneration for the Port Chicago 50 and have been for years, but it's a slow process. I want to say it took us at least 3 times in Congress for it to become a national park. You know, it had, I think they had to slip it into the defense, the DOD budget somehow in order for it to become a national park, because it's a story that they don't want to tell. However, it is changing. We are now in a place of someone reached out to us to find out what we have been doing in terms of exoneration. I want to mention Mark DeSaulnier, Congressman, who is our champion, who took over after George Miller, who was a retired congressman. They have worked so hard and so astutely. They know the politics involved in order for us to be successful. So I think in the next couple of years, we will actually be able to have the men exonerated. We actually asked for a presidential proclamation from President Obama, but it didn't happen. We have reached out to the attorneys who were involved in the pardoning of Freddie Meeks. We have done a lot of work, written letters, done all kinds of things that you would think that we need to do above and below, you know, behind the scene and in public. But what we would ask you to do is to individually write letters to, you could send letters to us actually, to friends of supporting this project. You can send letters to your congressman to right this wrong. You can share the story, which is very important because people don't know it exists. This is our website. I'm assuming everybody can see that. The Friends of Port Chicago National Memorial. It has that film on there. You saw it a little earlier. It has articles. It has all kinds of information that you would be interested in reading, I believe, to know more about the story. You could ask your city to write a statement or a proclamation or a declaration supporting this. We were gathering all that type of information that we sent off to Washington, D.C. And just at this moment, we're beginning a whole new effort. So, and we'll probably pick up on just keep going And by time President Biden his term is over, hopefully, if you just hold the vision with me, that it will be a done deal, that the men will have either had their convictions overturned or at least a presidential proclamation that speaks to their innocence, and then heroes. And the one other thing I wanted to mention, all the men that I have spoken to who served there, who were survivors of that explosion, all wanted everybody to know that they did their darndest to win World War II, that they did their work, and that they really want people to know they honored that facility. They never wanted to go back to the facility, particularly, but they wanted people to know they worked hard to do their part.
Wow, that's an awesome note to end on. A very, very heartfelt thanks to all of our panelists. This was, without question, an hour of power, an hour of advocacy. I know I speak for all of Salesforce when I say you have our full support and engagement all the way, whether it's through our Boldforce ERG or through our philanthropy organization, entity, I should say, and our senior management. And, really looking forward to the commemoration tomorrow, which my wife and I will attend in person. I know it's going to be awesome. But also, more importantly, looking forward to the park's vision being realized, and seeing people come and reflect and learn and become enlightened, as all of you have said. So appreciate everyone's efforts here. And I think I'll just turn it back over to you, Tom. But I would be remiss if I didn't thank Jason and Tom for their service, years of service, I should say. Thank you both.
You're certainly welcome.
Yeah, thank you very much, Keith. What a powerful, 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 powerful panel. Holy moly. You guys are so inspiring. Keith, you were incredible. Yeah, and just a little bit additional context. Why does a guy like me care about this? Well, the reason why I care about this is I was the executive officer of the base, and unfortunately, it took me 22 years in the Navy to learn about this story. So my passion is this story. I'm also involved in the Contra Costa County Task Force Port Chicago 50 exoneration efforts, along with my colleague Yuli and Reverend Diana and Jason. So we are executing a lot of efforts behind the scenes so that we can kind of get the Navy in a position to make a decision once Congress authorizes the Navy to make a decision on exoneration. We have a really great target of opportunity, if you will. I hate to use that target of opportunity term. To get it this time around, we have a Secretary of the Navy that is the first Latino Secretary of the Navy. So there is the right mix in motion. We just got to get Congress to authorize the Navy to make that decision, and then hopefully they're exonerated. So I will close with that, and thank you so much for all of your time.